Coming up on LevinTV, the appointment of Robert Mueller violates the United States Constitution, and every subpoena, indictment, and plea agreement should be held as null and void. It all starts now.
This is where freedom rings.
If you believe in America, if you believe in the Constitution empowers us. It's a new day. America's back. America's back, and America's going to get strong again. We're going to defend America, and we're going to defend our interests.
Liberty's voice, LevinTV.
Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is LevinTV on crtv.com. All right, one of those moments. This is a very, very important show as far as I'm concerned. Those of you who are watching it, you're going to be ahead of the curve. This is like a handful of other shows that I've done where we have broken significant ground, both legally and constitutionally, and then a year or so later, it's picked up by, Professor Dimwit and a homeless person, whatever, and they all show up in a conga line on cable TV. But this is very, very important. And I didn't invent this. I looked at what my friend wrote, I went over it very, very carefully, and I said, he's right. And I better start talking about this. What am I talking about? There's a number of friends of mine, we worked together as colleagues at the Department of Justice under President Reagan during the administration of Attorney General Meese. And I would argue that that Justice Department had the youngest, smartest, most competent conservatives, really, that the Department of Justice has probably ever had. No offense, but it's true. And it was the goal of Attorney General Meese to use personnel as policy, to put the very best people he could, with even if they had limited experience, as long as it was solid and substantive, in a variety of positions throughout the department. That's exactly what we did, from the Assistant Attorney General level, that's presidential appointment, the Associate Attorney General, the number 3 in the department, the Deputy Attorney General, and the Attorney General himself. And each office has a number of staff members. Some of them are career civil servants, some of them are political appointees, and we were very, very careful about who we would bring in as political appointees. I happen to know this for a fact since I was in charge of that. And a funny story before we get to this, and it's very, very important. Sam Alito was a career civil servant working in the Solicitor General's office. He was a Deputy Solicitor General and absolutely brilliant. And he came to my office one day. I handled a number of things, including the political appointments at the department. And he said, I would like to be a political appointee. And I said, well, who are you? And he showed me his credentials and so forth. Very, very solid from a constitutionalist point of view. I said, but we need more than that. I mean, I have to get you approved by the White House Presidential Personnel Office, which I worked at prior to joining the Meese Justice Department. And I personally want to know, where you stand on these issues. So he wrote a memo and talked about, his favorite books, what he had done, and so forth and so on. Not outwardly political, because he'd been a career civil servant. And so I got him approved. If I hadn't got him approved, I don't know if he'd be on the Supreme Court today. I'm not taking any credit whatsoever for that, but I'm just pointing it out. And that memo came up at his hearing, by the way. Well, look at this memo. And of course, they hate my guts, so they were trying to use it to smear him, but it didn't work. Well, that's the Department of Justice that I worked at, and Stephen Calabrese was among the smartest of the smart. He was on the staff of the Attorney General, as was I. I was Chief of Staff. He was, I believe, Special Counsel. Not the Mueller kind of Special Counsel. I mean, a normal Special Counsel to the Attorney General of the United States. David McIntosh, there were others, too. Steve would go on to become a professor at Northwestern Law School, where he's a professor today, and extremely smart. So he sent me a piece that he'd written, and he sent it to me, I believe, over the weekend. It was either Friday night, Saturday, I can't remember. But he sent it to me over the weekend, and he asked me what I thought about it. And then he made an adjustment to it. And he said, all right, I think this is my final version. And I read it again. I said, Steve, you hit this out of the park. You nailed it. He nailed what? Well, ladies and gentlemen, he's making the case from a constitutional perspective, and to me it's an overwhelming case, or I wouldn't be repeating it right now, that the actual appointment of Robert Mueller as special counsel violates the appointment clause of the United States Constitution. Well, Mark, we've had special counsel in the past and independent. This is different. I want you to think about what I'm saying now, because this will be repeated. This is the first time I'm saying it here and on the radio. And tomorrow night I'll be on Hannity on the Fox News channel. And so it'll be picked up and spread around. But I want you to listen to this first. The appointment of Robert Mueller special counsel by Rod Rosenstein and the manner in which Mueller is conducting himself and the manner in which Rosenstein is very passive about overseeing what Mueller is doing violates the appointment clause of the Constitution. There's an appointment clause or appointments clause in the Constitution because our framers were so brilliant, they thought that principal officers, that's the key word, principal, P-R-I-N-C, I-P-A-L, principal, like a principal of the school, that the principal officers of the executive branch should only serve after they've been nominated and then confirmed by the United States Senate. Nominated by the President, confirmed by the United States Senate, because they wanted the Senate to play a role in these top positions. So I'll give you an example. You look at the United States Department of Justice. Every single United States attorney has to be nominated and then confirmed by the United States Senate. Did you know that? Every single one of them. At Main Justice in Washington, D.C., you have the Attorney General, has to be nominated by the President, right? Confirmed by the Senate. The Deputy Attorney General, nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. The Associate Attorney General, the number 3, nominated by the President, has to be confirmed by the Senate. And a number, I think when I was a justice, or 8 or 9, maybe there's 400 of them now, but Assistant Attorneys General, the next level, the 4th level, they also must be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and so forth and so on. You get the point. So they all must be nominated to the Senate and confirmed if they're to serve under the appointment clause of the United States Constitution. See where I'm going with this? But I'm going to add more. I'm going to read from the Calabrese piece that he sent to me. He says, the appointment of Robert Mueller to be a special counsel to investigate whether President Trump's campaign illegally colluded with Russian agents in 2016 in the presidential election violates the appointment clause of the Constitution and is therefore unconstitutional. Follow me with this, it's fascinating. All actions taken by Mueller since his appointment on May 17, 2017 are therefore null and void, including all the indictments he's brought, all the searches he has conducted, including his wiretapping of Michael Cohen, and all plea arrangements he's entered into. I'm going to push this out, get it viral on this show, on my radio show, on the internet, on Fox, so all these defendants will make the argument. We'll see. Robert Mueller has behaved like the 96 U.S. attorneys who are principal officers of the United States and who must be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. He has not behaved like an assistant U.S. attorney who does not have to be nominated by the President, because he's what we call an inferior officer, and there are thousands and thousands of inferior officers in the executive branch who don't go to the Senate for confirmation. So he's not behaved like an assistant U.S. attorney who's an inferior officer and who may be appointed by a principal officer like Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. So the key distinction is the principal officer must be nominated and confirmed by the Senate, and an inferior officer who doesn't have to be nominated or confirmed, all right? Robert Mueller's appointment is therefore unconstitutional under Chief Justice Rehnquist, the late Chief Justice Rehnquist's majority opinion in a Supreme Court case in 1988 called Morrison versus Olson, and the Olson was Ted Olson. He was the head of the Antitrust Division, and Morrison was an independent counsel under the independent counsel statute, which has since lapsed, but they challenged the constitutionality of that statute. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld it, and what Calabrese has done, Professor Calabrese, he's looked at these opinions. So stay with me on this. Now, Robert Mueller's appointment is therefore unconstitutional under Chief Justice's majority opinion of Morrison versus Olson because it takes away, quote, too much, unquote, executive power from the President. It is unconstitutional under Justice Scalia's dissent in Morrison because Mueller does not have a boss who is actually supervising and directing what he's doing. He's rubber stamping it. Deputy Attorney General Mueller has deliberately abstained from playing such a role. Now, his piece is much longer than what I'm going to read to you, but I'm going to read what I consider the essential elements. Now, what does the Appointments Clause in Article 2 of the Constitution, what does it say? Article 2 is the clause that we generally refer to as involving the executive branch. Here's what it says, and I quote, "The President shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments." So the principals and the inferiors. The principals, the key people, the most executive, highest in the echelon, the executive, and those who are basically, they're important, but they work for the principals. Principal officers are selected by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. Inferior officers, Congress may allow to be appointed by the President alone, by the heads of the departments, or by the judiciary. It has been the long-standing practice of Congress and the executive branch to give principal officer status to all important and powerful public officials, even if they have a boss who can fire them. Remember I explained the Department of Justice? You have an Attorney General, the President can fire him. Deputy Attorney General, the Attorney General or the President can fire him. Associate Attorney General, and all these Assistant Attorneys General. You don't have to be the absolute top dog in a department, although that's a principal officer. There are positions below the top person in the department that are also considered critically important principal positions. For instance, cabinet secretaries have always been treated as being principal officers, even though they can be fired by the President. Deputy and assistant cabinet secretaries are also principal officers. They have to be nominated and confirmed, even though they can be fired by the cabinet secretary they report to, as well as by the President, because of the importance of the office they hold. It is unthinkable, for example, that the deputy secretaries of state or of defense or the Justice Department could be made an inferior officer. These officials simply exercise too much power to be denominated inferior officers. They are instead principal officers who must be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. He points out, it's obvious that Robert Mueller is behaving much more like a United States attorney who must be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate than he is behaving like an assistant U.S. attorney. Mueller has acted and has behaved like a principal officer, even though he was never nominated by the President nor confirmed by the Senate. The text of the Appointments Clause and the use of the word inferior elsewhere in the Constitution makes it clear that there are two prerequisites that must be met for someone to be an inferior officer and thereby excluded from being required the requirement of nomination and confirmation. First, one must have a boss who the inferior officer reports to, who can direct or fire the inferior officer. And second, an office cannot be inferior if the officer exercises as much power as is exercised by all the United States attorneys, the deputy and assistant cabinet secretaries, or lower federal court judges. Is there any doubt that Robert Mueller exercises as much, if not more, power than the United States attorney? He's not acting like an assistant U.S. attorney who reports to a United States attorney focused on one person or a handful of people in one case or a handful of cases. So this second test, as to the officer inferiority, is somewhat subjective in close cases, but it is very real nonetheless. If a prosecutor has as much power as a United States attorney, he is by definition a principal officer of the United States who must be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. There was a case called Edmund versus United States in 1997, a Supreme Court case. And Justice Scalia, the genius, admirably summarizes the history of the Appointments Clause in that case. Let me read a little bit of what he wrote. He said, as we recognized in Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, that was a big free speech campaign case in which the Supreme Court actually came down, for the most part, on the side of free speech. The Appointments Clause of Article 2 is more than a matter of etiquette or protocol. It is among the significant structural safeguards of the constitutional scheme. by vesting the president with the exclusive power to select principal, non-inferior officers of the United States. The Appointments Clause prevents congressional encroachment upon the executive and judicial branches. This disposition was also designed to assure a higher quality of appointments. The framers anticipated that the president would be less vulnerable to interest group pressure and personal favoritism than would a collective body. The sole and undivided responsibility of one man will naturally beget a livelier sense of duty and a more exact regard to reputation. Federalist number 76, Alexander Hamilton. The president's powers to select principal officers of the United States was not left unguarded, however, as Article 2 further requires advice and consent of the Senate. So, the point here is, a president does not have the time to pick all the inferior people. They're not inferior people, people in inferior positions in the executive branch. You know there's 2 million of them, right? And even on the political side, there's 3,300 of them. But he has the sole power granted under the Constitution to pick the key principles. And that's the way the framers of the Constitution wanted it. That's his job. But, they said, we want one more step, the advice and consent of the Senate. This serves both to curb executive abuses of the appointment power and to promote a judicious choice of persons for filling the offices of the Union. That, again, is Hamilton out of Federalist 76. By requiring the joint participation of the President and the Senate, the Appointments Clause was designed to ensure public accountability for both the making of a bad appointment and the rejection of a good one. Now, let me add here to my friend, the professor. What else is going on here? Mueller violates both of these, doesn't he? The president never appointed him, and yet he's a principal. The president never appointed him, plus the Senate never confirmed him. So that undermines all aspects of the Appointments Clause, because the president never appointed him as a principal officer, and the Senate never got a shot at him either, that is, to vote him up or down. Again, Hamilton. The blame of a bad nomination would fall upon the president singly and absolutely. The censure of rejecting a good one would lie entirely at the door of the Senate, aggravated by the consideration of their having counteracted the good intentions of the executive. If an ill appointment should be made, the executive for nominating and the Senate for approving would participate, though in different degrees, in the opprobrium and the disgrace. So in other words, it would be a disgrace of the Senate and the president rather than just one or the other. And that's why they felt that doing it this way, you're more likely to have people who are good, virtuous, have integrity, than not. Now, according to the Supreme Court, the Appointments Clause is an absolutely critical feature of separation of powers and of presidential power. Justice Scalia, again, explicitly says in this 1988 case, Edmund versus United States, that part of the test that must be met for an officer to be an inferior officer is the one must have a principal officer boss. Listen to this, quote, who is directing and supervising at some level, unquote, the work that the inferior officer is doing. Scalia went on and said in part, generally speaking, the term inferior officer connotes a relationship with some higher ranking officer, officers below the president. Whether one is an inferior officer depends on whether he has a supervisor. It's not enough that other officers may be identified who formally maintain a higher rank, got that? Or possess responsibilities of a greater magnitude. If that were the intention, the Constitution might have used the phrase lesser officer. Rather, in the context of a clause designed to preserve political accountability relative to important government assignments, we think it evident that inferior officers are officers whose work is directed and supervised at some level by others who were appointed by presidential nomination and the advice and consent of the Senate. Is Mr. Mueller's work being supervised? No. A rubber stamp is not supervision. It's not day-to-day supervision. It's really not supervision at all. This understanding of the Appointments Clause conforms with the views of the first Congress. On July 27, 1789, Congress established the first executive department, the Department of Foreign Affairs. And in so doing, it expressly designated the Secretary of the Department as the principal officer, his subordinate, the chief clerk of the department as an inferior officer. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is by design, his own design, not supervising and directing the work that Robert Mueller is doing, is he? Mueller is not an inferior officer, therefore, under Justice Scalia's test in Edmund versus United States. Now, there's a number of tests, but I want to hit the second test for officer inferiority, is the one laid out in Morrison versus Olson that I mentioned earlier, which held a statute could not interfere with the president's executive power, quote, too much, by giving executive power to so-called inferior officers, thus taking away the president's nomination power. So Mueller's appointed. It seems like it takes a lot of power away from the President of the United States, does it not? Now, Mueller is not empowered to perform only certain limited duties. The independent counsel's role here is not restricted primarily to investigation and, if appropriate, prosecution of certain federal crimes. In other words, he's all over the map. Admittedly, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein seems to have delegated to Mueller, quote, full power and independent authority to exercise all investigative and prosecutorial functions and powers of the Department of Justice. But this grant of authority does not include any authority to formulate policy for the government or the executive branch, nor does it give appellant any administrative duties outside of those necessary to operate her office. Mueller must comply to the extent possible with the policies of the department. That's his memo. So in Morrison versus Olson, the Supreme Court case in 1988, the Chief Justice then, Rehnquist says that to be an inferior office, one's office, I'm quoting, one's office must be limited in jurisdiction. The Mueller appointment is not the appointment of an inferior office because it flunks several parts of the Chief Justice's four-part test. The Mueller appointment also violates the final part of the Chief Justice's Morrison opinion because it interferes, quote unquote, too much with the president's executive power. Now, the Roberts, the current Supreme Court, briefly revised the two inferior officer appointment tests in a case in 2010. And Roberts, the Chief Justice, wrote this: our Constitution divided the powers of the federal government into three defined branches, legislative, executive, and judicial. Article 2 vests the executive power, in a President of the United States of America who must take care the laws are faithfully executed. Now, in light of the impossibility that one man should be able to perform all the great business of the state, the Constitution provides for executive officers to assist the Supreme Magistrate in discharging the duties of his trust. Now, the Chief Justice, Roberts, concluded that in this case, officers in question were removable at will by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and that the SEC had other power to review the Commission's work. So in light of these two factors taken together, the Chief Justice Roberts concluded that the commissioners in this case satisfied the Edmund test of officer inferiority, who were being directed and supervised by a principal officer, and were, in addition, unimportant officers who did not need to be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. But the case did not overrule or even address the Morrison versus Olson tests set out by the Chief Justice and the majority of the court. Now, where are we with all this? Here's where we are. Here's the bottom line. Under the Appointments Clause of the Constitution, Robert Mueller is not an inferior officer under Justice Scalia's test of officer inferiority, as set out in this Edmund case, nor as set out by the Chief Justice Roberts in the 2010 case, because Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is not supervising and directing Mueller's work, but is rubber stamping it. For this reason, Mueller is in effect and in practice exercising the powers of a principal officer, even though he's not been nominated by the President or confirmed by the Senate. Moreover, Robert Mueller is also not an inferior officer under Chief Justice Rehnquist tests in his majority opinion in Morrison, again in 1988. Two of the reasons the Supreme Court gave for finding Alexa Morrison, then the independent counsel, to be an inferior officer were that, one, she was empowered to perform only certain limited duties, and two, she had limited jurisdiction. On the facts of the case, Chief Justice Rehnquist concluded at the end of his opinion that the statute which authorized the independent counsel Morrison's appointment, which has since sunsetted out of existence, did not interfere too much, quote unquote, with presidential power to control the executive branch. This conclusion is defensible on the facts of that 1988 decision. In that case, only one government official, then Ted Olson, was prosecuted for one crime, which was the unlawful withholding of documents from Congress. At the time the prosecution was brought, Ted Olson had left public office and was a private citizen. This was a case where the special counsel was, one, performing only certain limited duties, and two, had only limited jurisdiction. Accordingly, the Supreme Court was probably right in concluding that on the facts of the Morrison case, the special counsel was not interfering too much on presidential power. But in the Robert Mueller case, Mueller is investigating whether the sitting president of the United States obstructed justice by firing Mueller's longtime friend Jim Comey to conceal collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia into the 2016 presidential election. Instead of pursuing only one person on a limited matter, Mueller has, without any real supervision by Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, one, indicted Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager, on 2 counts of misconduct having nothing to do with collusion with Russia. 2, indicted and accepted a plea bargain from Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor, for the crime of lying to government officials, an offense which Comey is guilty of and for which he has not been prosecuted. 3, obtained a similarly dubious plea bargain with former Trump campaign official George Papadopoulos. 4, indicted 13 Russian citizens and 3 Russian business entities, a decision which has major foreign policy consequences, by the way. Number 5, prosecuted Richard Pinedo and Dutch attorney Alex van der Zwaan. 6, subpoenaed numerous additional people. 7, wiretapped telephone calls covered by attorney-client privilege between Donald Trump and his longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. And 8, referred information illegally obtained from tapping Cohen's phone to the office of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York for prosecution for, among other things, criminally abusing the attorney-client privilege. Does that sound like a narrow investigation of 1 or 2 people to you that is carefully supervised by Mr. Mueller's boss? Mueller's investigation has made controlled leaks of information to the press designed to embarrass the president and hinder him in the performance of his duties, and his investigation has dominated the headlines for 1 year now, distracting President Trump from performing his job and making Mueller far more powerful and well-known than any United States attorney, all of who are principal officers nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And unlike this 2010 case where Roberts ruled correctly that these SEA officers were truly inferior officers, Robert Mueller's work is not being supervised and controlled by principal officer Rod Rosenstein. Moreover, unlike this 1988 case, again Morrison, this investigation is not limited in scope or in jurisdiction. To the contrary, Mueller's investigation is breathtaking in scope. His indictment of Russian citizens and business entities interferes with President Trump's ability to control foreign policy with Russia, and his breach of attorney-client privilege is a threat to civil liberties unlike any that has been attempted in this country. He writes, since Joe McCarthy's read scares, but I would leave that out. There's no question at all that Robert Mueller has behaved over the past year as if he were a principal officer of the United States, even though he has never been nominated by the president or confirmed by the Senate. He's best analogized to a U.S. attorney and not to an assistant U.S. attorney. Thus, even though Mueller has a boss in Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, he's not an inferior officer in any meaningful way. I should add, he writes, that while Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein is a principal officer and could take action that Mueller took, he cannot delegate his principal officer status to Mueller any more than Donald Trump could delegate his power to veto legislation to Robert Mueller. The Constitution itself assigns the veto power to the president and the principal officer power to Rosenstein. And it is unconstitutional for either of them to give their constitutional powers to some civilian third party. This is a very, very important point, one that I've touched on in the past myself. The conclusion. The Mueller investigation is unconstitutional. This means the indictments he brought are null and void. The subpoenas he has issued are null and void. The wiretaps he's engaged in were and are unconstitutional. His referral of information to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York is unconstitutional because any information he obtained is the fruit of the poisonous tree. Now, what do you make of all that? Is there any question in your mind that Robert Mueller is not the most powerful prosecutor in the United States today? Anyone disagree with me here? Is there any question in your mind that he's not the most powerful prosecutor in the United States today? Is there any question in your mind that he's not more powerful than any of the United States attorneys? Well, of course he is. He's chasing down a president of the United States. And the Appointments Clause of the Constitution, is there any question whatsoever in the clear text, the language of the Constitution, what the framers intended, that people that have this kind of power need to be appointed by a president and confirmed by a Senate, that they cannot be appointed by, the Deputy Attorney General, where he picks a third-party civilian, as Calabresi points out, and confers all kinds of powers on this individual? I think it's a good argument. I think it's an incredibly strong argument. I think it's one that should be used in court. I would even argue it's one that should be used by every defendant in this case. And it's one that should be used by the President of the United States should he need it, along with the other argument that I provided him and his team, which is a president cannot be indicted based on Department of Justice policies. I've said many times to you that the Constitution is the president's friend in this case. Mr. Mueller is an aberration. Mr. Mueller is conducting himself like an autocrat. Mr. Mueller does not have the power to remove a president. He does not have the power to force a president with a subpoena in front of a grand jury. Never been done. He does not have a power to substitute his own personal opinions for that of the United States Senate. The United States Senate only can determine upon impeachment whether a president is to be removed, not Mr. Mueller and not any jury. Under the Appointments Clause, Mr. Rosenstein does not have the power to subvert the Constitution in the Appointments Clause with the appointment of Mr. Mueller. And why has he done that? How has he done it? He's done it by not specifically and in any kind of a significant way managed Mr. Mueller. Matter of fact, the argument is that he has to stay away from Mueller, right? Mueller's independent. He has to keep his distance. He can't interfere with his cases. Isn't that what they argue? Well, that's an argument for him being a principal officer. And since he's a principal officer and not an inferior officer, this is a different process. This is a simple appointment by, a senior bureaucrat to a lower level bureaucrat. This is not. This is big deal. This has to be taken under the Appointments Clause where the president nominates and the Senate has to confirm. So I agree with this. So I will embrace this decision, this opinion by Professor Calabresi, and I will also embrace it as my own, which under the Appointments Clause of the United States Constitution, Article 2, Mr. Mueller was appointed, and given his conduct, given his duties, given his behavior, given the extent of his activities, and given the substance of his activities, Mr. Mueller is violating the Constitution. His appointment violated the Constitution, and hopefully the courts at some point, maybe the Supreme Court ultimately will understand this, because he's not conducting himself like anybody in the past that I'm aware of.